A friend recently asked me what my favorite holiday is. We were in a small group, and everyone else responded with things like 4th of July or Thanksgiving. I responded with Pentecost, of course. My friend gave me a funny look and informed me that while he had no idea what holiday I was talking about, he had heard of Pentecostals, and he did not know why I was excited about people talking to snakes. It was an interesting turn of events involving the conflation of Harry Potter with speaking in tongues and snake handling. He did have one thing right, though. Pentecost is kind of a weird holiday. It's one of the things I like about it. A lot of people don't know about it. There's fire, possible displays of public drunkenness, speaking in tongues, and unusual weather events. What I clarified to him, though, and what I tell all the kids in my Sunday school class is, the reason Pentecost is my favorite is it's the reason we're here today. And no, we don't spend it trying to talk to snakes. Now, you're smart people, and I know what you're thinking. How do we tell her Pentecost is actually next week? Next Sunday is the day where we get to wear red and celebrate, when we remember the disciples gathering for a feast with other people from all over, and we remember the wind that blows through the room and the tongues like fire that give each person the ability to speak in other languages. It's next Sunday that we will hear that those outside that day thought the disciples were all drunk until those who were far from home heard those inside speaking in each of their languages. It's next week when we say Happy Birthday, Church, as we celebrate the arrival of the Holy Spirit and the birth of the church. Today is not that day. But one thing I have long lamented is that we don't have a season of getting ready for Pentecost like we do with Advent for Christmas or Lent for Easter. So think of this as Pentecost Eve. And then, if you're as Pentecost obsessed as I am, you think of the entire year as leading up to it, or the entire year stemming from it. As it is now, the build up to Pentecost includes some stories of a resurrected Jesus hanging out with various disciples, then Jesus' ascension to heaven, which historically and theologically has never been my favorite, followed by some debate over adding another disciple, and then finally we get to Pentecost. Well, the timing is precise, exactly 50 days after the resurrection. It seems to me to be kind of an aimless time where the disciples who don't quite know who they are or what they're doing try to find meaning again. It's a feeling I think I understand now in a way I couldn't before. When we lost Dad 2 years ago, I remember feeling out of touch with myself, like I couldn't quite hold myself together and I had no idea what was happening. It was bad enough that I couldn't drive without getting lost in my own neighborhood. When you lose someone that big in your life, it's hard to know what to do next or where you're going because it's hard enough just being. In the case of Pentecost, I imagine the disciples wandering around, getting lost, trying to do basic things like find their way home, while they're in the middle of a religious movement. Big things were happening, but that could easily have been the end. Well, today is not Pentecost. What we are in is the season of Easter. I have started to think of the Easter story as an alternate way of telling the story of Pentecost. I think they're both about how the movement was so big that losing the leader wasn't the end. That no matter what, the story wouldn't end there. They're stories of passing the mantle from Jesus to the disciples. In the original mantle passing story we heard earlier from Betsy, the prophet Elijah is going through a rough time. He believes he's going to die. He asks Elisha to follow him and take on the work. In this case, Elijah does this by putting his cloak over Elisha, and Elisha follows him to learn from him and eventually become a prophet himself. The same thing happens here, only with fire and a whole group of people. Pentecost gives the disciples a mission. It passes the mantle from Jesus to the disciples So the story ends not with death and not with the resurrection of Easter, but with the resurrection of the people that in fact never ends at all. Because Pentecost happened, Pentecost happens. That's because Pentecost is all about community coming together and continuing the story. The Easter resurrection story is dark and hidden, ending with a mysteriously empty tomb. But Pentecost is different. Pentecost happens when we think we're alone, abandoned, wandering, and lost on our own, only to be surprised with loud and wild answer that we are not alone in the work. Because like indoor wind and fire, everything that gave birth to the church is not only a surprise, but loud and wild. For that is what the church was meant to be, a community with all its chaos and all its care. In her book, Saving Jesus from Those Who Are Right, Rethinking What It Means to Be Christian, Carter Hayward writes, "From the beginning, God is our power in mutual relation, its source and resource. It was true before the world as we know it began. We humans are participatory agents with God, of more sacred power, more creative, transforming spiritual energy." Remember how earlier I said Pentecost is why we're all here today? This is it. Pentecost is inherently relational, and we cannot Pentecost alone. There's no communication, and there's no sudden ability to understand one another if we aren't in the conversation to begin with. Pentecost is about living in community, in relationship with one another and with God. And we can't have the church without Pentecost, because we can't have the church without each other. Pentecost is messy, but so is living in community. It's complicated and sometimes frustrating to keep living and working together, but this messy environment is where wonderful things happen. I think again of where I was 2 years ago, when my community chose to step right into the mess and help me, because that's what you do. When Nolan drove me to work because I couldn't find my way, and when Selena met with me over lunch breaks so I could have someone to talk to, and when Betsy and Donna and Rich held me, and all the others who showed up and cared and loved and remembered. Hayward writes that it is only through our vulnerability to our common life, our openness to learning even from our enemies, and our ongoing struggle for mutuality that our relational power is sparked and we are able to God. You may have noticed that I've got a couple nouns that I'm turning into verbs today. Apologies to my English teacher sister. Some words just need more action to them today. When we Pentecost and when we God, we are being active participants in our relationships with each other and with God and with the world. There is no sitting by and passively watching a church be born, and there is no passivity in keeping one going either. Which brings me to my number one favorite thing about Pentecost. It never really ended. Jesus passes his mantle to the disciples who pass it on, and this keeps happening and will keep happening. In the UCC, we like to say God is still speaking, and that is exactly what happens when we keep passing the mantle. We choose to keep doing the work, we choose to keep building the kingdom, we choose to keep listening and speaking and learning and exploring and loving. We choose to keep Pentecosting and to keep Godding. So perhaps my disappointment about not having a season of Pentecost or a time to get ready for Pentecost is unfounded. Maybe Pentecost happens all the time. Maybe Pentecost happens whenever it wants and we can never prepare for it because it's always a surprise. But we're always invited. So happy Pentecost.